the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Thank you. And let me just say, we are coming up on a remarkable moment. In just a short time, the United States will mark 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document filled with bold language about liberty, equality, and human dignity. Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. You know, for 10 years now, the Not Old Better Show has celebrated health, wellness, culture, history, and the stories that remind us we're not old, we're better now. As America commemorates 250 years of independence in 2026, this special series offers a dynamic explanation of America's past, present, and future. Explore the people, ideas, conflicts, and aspirations that have shaped America and how the past informs the challenges and possibilities ahead. At 250, America is still young enough to dream and seasoned enough to know that freedom asks something of every generation. Through our Smithsonian Associates interview series, we invite you to hear that story and more stories with a fresh perspective, honest reflection, and renewed purpose. In this series, we're stepping back, not to settle history, but to explore it, to look at the places, the people, and the moments that have shaped who we are and who we're still becoming. As we approach America's 250th birthday, it's tempting to look back and see 1776 as inevitable, as if independence was always the destination, but it wasn't. At the beginning of that year, 1776, most colonists weren't calling for a new nation. They were still holding on, hoping to remain part of the British world, asking for fairness, for representation, for their rights as subjects of the crown. And then in just 12 months, something extraordinary happened. Ideas spread, words took hold, courage grew, fear sharpened resolve. A pamphlet called Common Sense found its way into homes, taverns, and army camps. The language of loyalty gave way to the language of liberty. And by year's end, independence wasn't just possible, it was necessary. That transformation, that turning of the mind is the story we're exploring today on our feature series with Smithsonian Associates. Because 1776 is more than a date. It's a reminder that nations are not only fought for, they are argued into existence. And that the ideas at the heart of America, liberty, equality, self-government, are never finished. They're handed down, tested, and asked of each generation all over again. For our America 250 series with Smithsonian Associates, we're honored to welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Smithsonian Associate, and Professor Edward J. Larson, author of Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. Smithsonian Associate Edward J. Larson is our guest today. Professor Larson, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure to be talking to you, of course, about your wonderful book, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. The timing is just perfect, Professor Larson. I just have to say it. It's just the book is arriving right at this moment when we as Americans, we seem to be arguing over the meaning of the founding, perhaps as intensely as the founders maybe argued themselves. And I think what's so striking about all of this is that, certainly from your book, I got that 1776 wasn't inevitable necessarily. It was a year of persuasion. It was this year of fear, courage, absolutely, and a dramatic change of mind. So let's go back to that year, 1776, when it began. Most of the colonists were still asking to be treated kind of as better Britons, if you will, not as separate Americans. And so I wonder if for our listeners, our Smithsonian Associates audience that might be hearing that and be a bit surprised, what was the emotional breaking point, the moment when this idea of, conviction and grievance just kind of parted ways? What really took place there?
Well, what you're asking now is the thing that surprised me most in my research. There are certainly books about the American Revolution, excellent ones. But they tell a very different story. The Revolutionary era, I've taught it for years at the University of Georgia, really began in 1765 with the Stamp Act crisis. Even earlier, 1763 with the Quebec Act, but really got going with the Stamp Act. And people began objecting that they were given the same rights as other British subjects under the king. And that's all they were fighting for. You can see it in everything they said and everything they wrote. They wanted to be treated equally with British subjects of the king in England and in Scotland. And taxation without representation was just the main item. When the Declaratory Act came in 1767, it said that Parliament can make all laws on any subject to bind the colonists on any matter. But wait, what was fundamental to their rights as British subjects under the king is a representational government to an extent. Sure, the king overstood everything. He was the executive. But for taxes, for basic laws, it had to go through Parliament. And in England and Scotland and in Wales, they got to vote for the Parliament. None of the colonists could vote for the. And so what they said from the very beginning, as we have our own assemblies, they should pass laws governing us, including raising money to fight British wars and to support Britain, of course. But it has to go through our colonial assemblies, the House of Burgesses in Virginia or the General Court in Massachusetts. And then, of course, the king can veto it. He appoints royal governors. They weren't doubting that. But they weren't being given the same basic rights as English people. That's because the English people didn't think they were equal. They thought they were subordinate people. They were their colonists, there to serve them. And what happened was the colonists have been fighting for that. We've got to remember the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Those were in 1775, not 1776. Congress adopted the New England militia that was besieging the British occupiers of Boston in 1775, and they sent Washington up to lead it. They made the Continental Army. And in their declaration for the causes of taking up arms, they said, we're not fighting for independence. We pledge our allegiance to the king. We're fighting for our equal rights as British subjects under the king. And they sent the Olive Branch petition as well. And they kept hoping that the king, their king, would reconcile it. And what happened, what made them switch, and you can see it, there were a few colonists who were few patriots who had turned to be pro-independence in 1775, just a couple. But the main ones, Washington, John Adams, all these people, they hadn't switched yet. But it was a confluence of factors, not one thing. And it was part that the king refused to receive their Olive Branch petition and then gave his annual major speech to Parliament in the fall, which only reached the colonists in January. It only appeared in newspapers then, where he declared the colonists in open rebellion and that he would back Parliament with the Declaratory Act. He was going to send the largest army, 32,000 soldiers, the largest army Britain had ever assembled to send overseas. And he was going to send thousands of warships, the largest navy ever sent, and he was going to hire German mercenaries, and he was going to crush the colonists to secure their subjection. Coupled with the showing of that activity, Bunker Hill had been bad enough, but on January 1st, the Royal Navy Squadron bombarded Norfolk, Virginia, which was then the second largest city in the American South, and the main port for the Chesapeake Bay, which is Maryland, Virginia, and the Albemarle of North Carolina. And the ensuing fire destroyed 98% of the town. This was it wasn't a Patriot stronghold, but it was the key. It was sort of the key to the Chesapeake, and the Chesapeake, Virginia, was a center of Patriot resistance. And then, at the same time, the same newspapers that are reporting the King's speech from the throne and the destruction of Norfolk by the hands of British, the sort of tyranny they were going to impose, was Common Sense. Common Sense came out at the same time, and Common Sense gave a new meaning. It was the first major pamphlet arguing for independence and allowed colonists ideas help people understand events. And the events drove it, no question. But Common Sense gave them a new way to understanding it, and their only way they were only going to get their liberty was through independence. They could never trust the king, an authoritarian ruler like the king, to give it to them.
Thank you for that. And the book is fascinating in the way that it spells out and really leads to this amazing conclusion about common sense and Thomas Paine, and how it wasn't just slogan driven. This was a shift in consciousness, but it became a very real shift for farmers and laborers and tradesmen and soldiers on the American shores, on the U.S. shores, and families who, many of those individuals never thought of themselves as revolutionaries at all, but that really stirred up emotion. What was it that really drove this, that, this wasn't so much an argument for independence anymore? This was a new language.
Yeah, it was what it did. I think if Common Sense had come out a year earlier, it would have fallen on deaf ears. And a year later, it wouldn't have made any difference. But its timing has everything. And these things were happening around them. The king was going to crush their liberty, which they had treasured. America was different. The colonists were different because they had economic, political, and religious opportunity. They had those things that you didn't have in England. In England, you're going to be whatever back then, there was no economic opportunity. You were going to be whatever your parents were. And there was no fluidity. If your father was a blacksmith, you're going to be a blacksmith. If your father worked on a manor as one of the laborers there, you were going to do. That's what you were going to do. In America, people had been able to make a better life for themselves, to get economic independence. And Common Sense pointed out to these people who had and the people who really were benefited from this were the farmers, the tradesmen that you mentioned. These people had opportunity they never would have had. A lot of them came from second sons who were never going to have an opportunity. They'd moved over. Suddenly they'd established themselves their own farm. And the frontier, which was taken away from them by the British with the Quebec Act, was their opening opportunity. And suddenly Common Sense spoke to them because they said, what is the purpose of government? Now, nobody in England would have asked that. The purpose of government was, the king was the king was the king, and the government was the king, and I am the state, as Louis XIV would say, and England acted like. No, the purpose of government, Thomas Paine says, drawing on Locke, is to protect security and to protect individual liberty. And the goal of government is to maximize human happiness. That's what we're all about. And suddenly, common people, rich people, don't think about those things because they have them. But common people in America did. And they said, yeah, that's what it's all about. Government should serve us. We shouldn't serve the government. And it argued that everyone is equal, as he says famously, that of more worth in the eyes of God and his fellow man, is one honest man than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Now, that is the most American of statements. Would be incomprehensible in France. It would be incomprehensible in Europe, be incomprehensible in China. No limit to that. Empire of China back then. It would have been incomprehensible anywhere. But here, it rang true. So it argued that all men, at least all free men, are really equal. And Thomas Paine was an abolitionist, so he didn't want slavery. And everyone matters. And government's purpose is to benefit. And the way to get there is not through authoritarian rule, because any authoritarian rule rots at its core and just serves the authoritarians, he argues. No, the way to get there is through Republican government, through representative government. And the important thing is you have free, fair, and frequent elections that are not artificially gerrymandered, that represent, so that the public, the overall public, is truly represented in the assemblies, which then pass the laws, and those laws under a constitution are supreme.
You mentioned gerrymandering, and certainly in Virginia where I live, there's a great deal of discussion over gerrymandering, a concept that could change the way we all vote. And you just talked about this idea of tradesmen and farmers and laborers and different settings for where this really was taking place. And it was interesting to me as I read in the book, which, again, congratulations, Professor Larson, just a wonderfully researched book, excellent book. But it struck me with some parallels to today, just as gerrymandering is a concept of today, too. We seem to be focused on the war in all of these different locations and all of these different settings. And so perhaps 1776 was our first media war, because certainly it was taking place in the newspaper. It was Thomas Paine was writing Common Sense. There was really so much about that parallels today. It really helped me to make the story feel very, very current, to bring history to life, to think about it that way. Did you feel the same?
Well, it certainly was in many ways a media war. That's a good observation. Now, I don't know if it was the first, but the reason why it'd be an early one was because before this, and anywhere else in the world, not many people could read. Only a few priests or scholars or government officials could read. So the reading rates were under 5% in most of Europe. In America at that time, 60 to 70% of the people were literate. The free people who, women and men. And the reason is because there was economic opportunity. And so there was a reason to read. You'd read newspapers to see what economic opportunities were available, what you could get, where you could buy things, where you could get land, where you could get equipment. And and you got to vote for your local assemblies. So you needed to read that. And also many parts of the country were, they weren't like a episcopal government religiously. There was participatory religion, at least in the Northeast and in Pennsylvania. The Congregational Church, the Baptist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and Quaker Church. And their people needed to be able to read their Bibles. So there was a lot of reasons why people needed to read. And so you could write a pamphlet. Common Sense, at the time newspapers had a circulation of under 5,000 copies, even the most popular one. Over 100,000 copies of Common Sense flew off Patriot presses. And then it was read aloud at different places. So people could read these documents. Now, you're not going to have a media war where people can't read, especially, there was no oral communication. There wasn't any radio. So they could read these arguments for themselves, and that made it. Now, the one exception, there may be others, but the English Civil War was largely media-driven as well. That's the war from about 100 years before, when the people of England rose up, mostly the Puritans in England rose up, and the separatists rose up and overthrew and executed the king and ruled for 10 years under the Long Parliament, a Republican government. That was a direct inspiration in New England. They talked about it a lot. They began to see King George III, much like their Puritan ancestors viewed Charles I, who they overthrew. Then when the Restoration came, when the aristocracy took back over in 1660, many of the revolutionaries, many of the Roundheads, as they were called, migrated to New England, my ancestor among them. That's when they came over. They fought for independence under Republican government, inspired by writers like Milton and others. And so, in a way, if you read the letters from the troops in the field, if you read the sermons from 1776, from most of the American army back then, the Continental Army was the former New England militia, and most of them are direct ties to these earlier. Their ancestors had fought in the English Civil War. It's true with me. My grandfather times 8 fought in the English Civil War. He moved to the colonies, Massachusetts, and his great-grandson, my great-grandfather times 5, came out at the call of Paul Revere and was at Concord and in 1775. Now, these people, if you read their letters, and we have an enormous variety of their letters, they thought they were fighting for their same God-given rights. And again, in 1775, they thought their God-given rights were as subject of the king. And after 1775 and 1776, they realized those God-given rights would only come through independence. I love this is so beautiful. It's captured at the time many ways, but after the Revolution, years after they'd both been president, John Adams sent Thomas Jefferson a letter. This is I think 1817, so long after both had passed. And he writes in that letter to Thomas Jefferson, what was the revolution? What was the revolution, he asked. And then, as Adams likes to do, he answered his own question. He went on, he said, it wasn't the war. The revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the American people. And it was all over by 1776.
If you're just joining us, stay right where you are because this story is only getting more intense. We've been talking with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Smithsonian associate Edward J. Larson about the year 1776. And if there's one thing that's clear, it's this: independence was not a sure thing, not even close. Ideas were spreading, yes, but so was fear. The British Empire wasn't retreating, it was regrouping. Ships were gathering, troops were landing. And what had begun as a war of words was becoming something far more dangerous. Because here's the question hanging in the air at this moment in 1776. What happens when a bold idea meets a brutal reality? When the language of liberty collides with defeat, with retreat, with loss? Washington's army is pushed back. New York is slipping away. Soldiers are exhausted, outnumbered, and uncertain. And for many, the question is no longer, should we declare independence? It's, can we survive it? This is where the story turns, because what comes next isn't just about philosophy, it's about endurance. It's about sacrifice. It's about whether a belief is strong enough to hold when everything around you starts to fall apart. And just when it seems like the cause might break, something unexpected happens. Stay with us, because this next part of 1776 may be the most important of all. Let's get back to our conversation with Smithsonian associate Edward J. Larson. Title of the book is Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. Smithsonian Associate Edward J. Larson is our guest, author of this wonderful book. I want to talk to you for just a moment, too, about the title, Why 1776 Matters. Certainly, I think for so many of my audience, we've experienced decades, perhaps, of political division. It's a reality in this country, absolutely. But I think the big question, and it's certainly a question that we're facing today, is how do we move beyond frustration to a world where we're solving problems, to founding? Because certainly there was a great deal of lack of unification on the founders of our country, yet in 1776, they were able to keep disagreement from collapsing into paralysis. How do we do that today?
Well, we can't overlook the fact that the Revolutionary War was a bit of a civil war. There was division, for sure. There were loyalists. There were loyalists on Staten Island and Long Island that greeted those 32,000 troops that were unloaded in July and early August and late June of 1776. There were. And then there was a bitter fighting between loyalists and patriots in the American South, especially, but also in the New York area, because New York was the center of Toryism or loyalism into New Jersey. So there was a division. But what had happened is the working majority, by a best, they didn't have official public opinion surveys there, but you can historians have looked at this for years. By a 2-to-1 majority, by the end of 1776, by a 2-to-1 majority, the American people that were engaged and involved, there were a lot of enslaved people who weren't. There were Native Americans. There were people on the frontier who never got engaged in the Revolutionary War. But those that were engaged, 2-to-1 in favor of independence. Independence, thinking that independence was their reason to, well, how did the Declaration of Independence put it? Their God-given right, or their inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that they would get it through independence. So they shared a common goal, and they ended up taking over all 13 of the state legislatures. Now, there were more than 13 colonies. There were ones in Canada, like Nova Scotia, old English colonies, and they didn't go, or in the Caribbean, like the Bahamas or Barbados, Jamaica, they didn't go. So it's not like it was all the colonies, but in these, the working majority, and those working majority took control. And in that sense, there was division then, but they overcame it by having a noble goal. Indeed, as Paine said in Common Sense, he says, for this goal, for this ideal, we can defeat anybody they throw against us if we're basically united. And that was the cause. Now, what was the cause? Well, it was rule of law. It's that we're fighting for our fundamental, at least among free white males, the idea that of our equality, that we're equally important, that we are under state constitutions, because every state adopted a new state constitution, rejected the Royal Charter in 1776. That new constitution had declarations of liberty or Bill of Rights guaranteed for everyone. You weren't going to have a tyranny majority. They guaranteed representative rule. They broadened the franchise to basically all free white males. You had to own property or pay taxes, but almost everyone back then did. So there was broad suffrage, 50 times greater than in England, which were then the most representative governments. And so they had a common goal and ideal. They differed on a lot of tactics. Sure, there were efforts to replace George Washington and replace him with someone else, Charles Lee, and then Horatio Gates. There were differences in tactics of should you defend New York City or should you evacuate. But ultimately, they had a common goal. And I think keeping that common goal is the way to bring back a common cause for America, because even in the most united times in American history, say the 50s or whenever, there were divisions. People dissented, but we had a common goal. And I would say that's rule of law, fair, free, and frequent elections, constitutional liberties, realizing we are under a balance of powers with checks and minuses. Basically, the American system pursuing the American dream.
The other thing that struck me too, and I want to get your comment on this, we'll wrap up after this question, Professor Larson. Many in my audience, 50s, 60s, 70s age, beyond, we think often about what type of country we're leaving to our children and our grandchildren. This idea of inheritance and stewardship, I think, is certainly on our minds. What is it that 1776 asks of us now, particularly as a civic responsibility and as something in terms of, as we think in terms of inheritance and stewardship?
Well, of course, as any generation, we face challenges that we don't even understand. I don't understand what AI is going to do to us. AI is going to affect us, not just our jobs, our whole way of thinking. Social media is affecting how people think. So it's hard to know what they were. But when I think about this, I think about that James Madison, the supposed architect of the Constitution, certainly key there. At the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Patrick Henry, who was an opponent of the new Constitution, said this will never work. This will never work. It'll lead to, you've given way too much power to the federal government, and on top of that, way too much power to the president. And between the two, I believe in states' rights. I believe in the power of the Virginia House of Burgesses. We need to protect that. And he says they're just going to take everything from us. And he gave a lot of examples, including taking our enslaved people, but other things too. And Madison looked back at him and he said, and I wrote it down here in case it came up, I go on this great Republican principle. The people will have the virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched condition. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a fanciful idea. If there be sufficient virtue and intelligence in the community, it will be exercised in the selection of those men, the leaders, so that we do not depend on their virtue or put our confidence in our rulers, but in the people who choose them. That is the responsibility of us, of our generation, and the middle-aged generation. Sandra Day O'Connor used to plead for more civic education. I think civic education is important, but it's this ultimate virtue. We can never trust our leaders. We have to trust in the people because we are a government of the people. That's why Benjamin Franklin, when he left the Constitutional Convention, was asked by Elizabeth Powell, what form of government have you created for us? He said, it's a republic if you can keep it, if we can keep it, and that we is us.
Smithsonian Associate Professor Edward J. Larson, Pulitzer Prize winner, author of this remarkable new book, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. I think, Professor Larson, I just appreciate your time so much as you go into ongoing work. We would love to have you back because you really have driven this point home that 1776 still absolutely matters, not as some marble monument out there in Washington, D.C., but this conversation that it can get messy, certainly uncertain in many, many times like today, costly and human. But thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to seeing you at your upcoming presentation. Please, audience, check out our show notes for more details about Professor Larson's book, Declaring Independence, and his upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. Thanks, Professor Larson, for being so generous. We sure appreciate it. And please come back, sir.
I would love to come back. I've served in its capacities with Smithsonian before. It's the greatest museum in the world. Thank you for being part of it.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old, Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series commemorating 250 years of independence in 2026 on radio and podcast. Professor Edward J. Larson will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. So please check out our show notes for more details on all of that. But we've had a wonderful conversation about 1776 and his wonderful new book, Declaring Independence. Because 1776 reminds us history can feel distant, like something settled, something decided long ago. But 1776 reminds us that's never really true. What Smithsonian Associate Edward Larson has shown us today is that this country didn't begin with certainty. It began with argument, with risk, with people who were unsure, divided, even afraid, and who moved forward anyway. Independence was not inherited. It was chosen. Chosen in pamphlets, passed hand to hand. Chosen in rooms where voices disagreed. Chosen on battlefields where the outcome was anything but guaranteed. And maybe that's why 1776 still matters, because it asks something of us, not to admire it from a distance, but to wrestle with it, to think about what it means to live in a country where the central idea, the bold, fragile, unfinished idea, is that power rests with the people. That's not a relic. That's a responsibility. So as we mark this 250th anniversary, maybe the real question isn't just what happened back then, it's what we all do with it now. My thanks to Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Smithsonian Associate Edward J. Larson. Remember, you can find out more details about Professor Larson's upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates in our show notes today. Of course, Professor Larson is author of the new book, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. Thanks to all of you for listening, for thinking, and being part of our conversation about America 250. You can hear this episode and all about our America 250 series with Smithsonian Associates at notold-better.com. Follow us on Twitter at notoldbetter and Instagram at notoldbetter. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogel saying I look forward to having you join me again next time. Please be well, be safe. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. Please join us again for another conversation with Smithsonian Associates and America 250. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next time.